guys. How's everybody doing out there tonight? I hope everybody is looking forward to this, because this has been something that me and Thomas have been trying to put together here for a few weeks now. And I'm very, very excited that we were actually able to get together. Of course, I'm sure most of you tuning in know me, TJ with Dead History. Obviously, this YouTube channel that I have. Obviously, what I'm doing is a presidential series each week. I do a new president in chronological order, and I kind of just give you a brief overview of their life, their legacy, their presidency, and then, of course, really what the main focus of my channel is their gravesite, where they're buried, hence the name Dead History. So when I actually was doing James Buchanan series a couple weeks ago, I used a photo of a book cover. The book is titled Bosom Friends, and Thomas Balcerski, who is going to be our guest tonight, he is the author of that book. And funny enough, him and I had already been following each other on Instagram, and he wrote me a message and said, "Hey, I was really, really happy to see my book cover in your James Buchanan video." And obviously, I didn't realize it was him, and so we got connected, and we decided we definitely wanted to do a little live stream and talk about the book, his book, but also talk about a lot of other things, because Thomas is a presidential historian. He's also a professor of history. He's going to tell you a little bit about himself here in a minute. But that's kind of how this all came together. It was just kind of by chance that I used his book cover for one of my slide photos, and it just kind of grew from there. So without further ado, as they say, I will introduce Thomas Balcerski, who is the author of Bosom Friends, like I said. And Thomas, if you don't mind, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, that sort of thing, and then we can kind of go from there.
All right. Thank you, TJ, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the live stream tonight. Today, I taught a course on American Southern history, and I teach courses here on early American history, history of American society, of course, on the presidents and first ladies. Eastern Connecticut State University, where I teach, we have more than 100 history majors, many of whom go on to teach high school or middle school history. So I have the real honor and privilege to, as my primary job, to work with mostly future teachers of public schools here in Connecticut, as well as future historians, those who work in public history sites and those who work across different fields. So I really enjoy what I do. And in addition to that, thank you for the introduction to my book, because yes, in addition to that, I'm an active scholar and researcher. I have a PhD in history, which allowed me to write a dissertation. And from the dissertation came a book. And I'm really happy to say the book has, I think, made an impact on the scholarship around President James Buchanan and Vice President William Rufus King, the other individual on whom it focuses. And since it was published in 2019, it's been reviewed across various newspapers and journals, and it continues to be discussed and reviewed. So I'm really happy to bring that here tonight, as well as to talk about history, presidential history, politics, and how it relates to history. I'm really open to seeing what your viewers have to ask us tonight.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight, Thomas. And so everybody knows, I guess you could consider me a little bit of a bad interviewer, because I have not yet read Bosom Friends. I actually was just telling Thomas I ordered it 2 nights ago on Amazon. So I am very anxiously awaiting the arrival of the book. I think it's supposed to be here tomorrow, actually. And I'm looking forward to reading it, because when I do my videos each week, I definitely do some research about each president. And then, of course, I found your book, and I was like, wow, this is fascinating. So one thing I do want to ask you, Thomas, I'll kind of jump right in, if you don't mind me asking you some questions, of course. What was it that made you pick this topic? Because, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, I've kind of looked a bit. It doesn't seem like anybody else has written a book on this specific subject of the relationship between Buchanan and William Rufus King. and the possible, the rumors of a homosexual relationship that they had and that sort of thing. What fascinated you, or what interested you to pick this topic and write this book?
That's an excellent question, TJ, because after all, when historians write books, they spend years researching and writing. So there has to be something that draws you to the topic. And for me, it was one of the really most interesting parts of the dissertation research I did, as I mentioned, in graduate school. It was one of several chapters about male friendship. And if there's a thematic that interests me as a scholar, it's the notion of gender, manhood, and friendship. I found evidence across the 19th century of political friendships carrying important significance, really, for the politics of the era, as well as being personally important to the men involved. And Buchanan and King was a particular case, because here we have two men who never married. They were lifelong bachelors, and who worked together throughout their time in Washington, D.C., and then when they were separated for a period until King's death in 1853, to try to achieve high political office. And so the thought that a intimate male friendship between two individuals could bring one man to the vice presidency, William Rufus King, and the other to the presidency, James Buchanan, fascinated me. And given today how valuable still, I think, friendships and networks are across our politics, I wanted to see if we could find some antecedents, some history to this really important construct that still powers American politics.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's so very true. And what I find fascinating about this is, in my brief little research, of course, of Buchanan, I did go and see in my travels last year during the pandemic, I did go and see William Rufus King's gravesite down there in Alabama as well. And I've done a little bit of research on him, but more so, of course, on Buchanan. And everything that I read was like, well, him and King were homosexuals together and this sort of thing. And what my next question to you is, and I don't want to give too much of the book, information away, but I hope you can touch on this, is this, rumor of them having a homosexual type, relationship, and was that something that was relevant when they were alive and during their political career, or is this something that was more so drawn up afterwards, after their political career and even after their death?
Yeah, that's an excellent point, since it's been more than 150 years since James Buchanan's passing and burial in Lancaster. And so in that time, we've had generations subsequently, both in the Buchanan and King families, their nieces particularly, as well as descendants, and then archivists, librarians, and historians who've looked through the case. And my basic point would be, since the language of same-sex attraction, identity, and orientation even has changed over time, even to describe their relationship as homosexual, which is to say, to use a term that's not even in vogue anymore really today, but was in vogue very much in the 20th century, is already to be, well, anachronistic, to kind of use language that they themselves did not have. So when we break down what components we mean in talking about them in this way, we then try to read the evidence that survives and doesn't survive, the absence of evidence even, to see what can be found about them. And I would say that historians have gotten very creative in their reading of the evidence, as have novelists and other commentators. In fact, I would say perhaps the most in-depth study, if you will, of the Buchanan-King relationship prior to my own was by John Updike, a famous American novelist and author. And he wrote a book. Yeah, he wrote a book called Memories of the Ford Administration, a reference to Gerald Ford in the mid-1970s, but it was actually an exploration of James Buchanan. And he devotes significant time to the Buchanan-King relationship. And being a novelist and being a great American literary genius, he's able to imagine that relationship. And Updike's conclusions, I should say, very much match my own, having spent similar amounts of time in the archives, having read the same documents as him. And so if there's one person I kind of find myself riffing off of, it's actually John Updike.
Wow, that's really fascinating. I would have had no idea, and that's interesting. Now, you say your own conclusion and Updike's, you guys had similar. And again, I don't want to give too much away, but I did ask you the very forward question a few weeks back.
Right.
So was President James Buchanan what we would consider a homosexual? Was he, attracted in a sexual way to men? And you told me the long answer and the short answer is no. So if you don't mind kind of just touching on that, what's the overall conclusion? And, how did these rumors even really begin is really what I want to know. Is this something they just, because like you said, back when these two men, during their political career, I don't know too much about the way society looked at, male-male relationships or female-female relationships. I mean, was it something that was kind of really taboo that nobody said anything about, or was it like, behind closed doors, everybody would assume and these rumors started? Was it something that I think it was who was it that made a very, very was it Andrew Jackson that made a very disparaging remark about the relationship between King and Buchanan? I think he called one of them Mrs. something or something. In fact, you could probably remind me. So, sure. I mean, again, and I'm sure that was back then. So was this something that was like an overwhelming overall feeling of a lot of political people in the Washington circle, that they felt that these two men had a very interesting relationship, or was this something that nobody thought anything of?
Yeah, it's a lot there, and I appreciate it because it allows me to first unpack a key point you've been driving at about rumor, innuendo, and particularly gossip. How does it work? How does it work in politics? And how is it that certain names stick? We lived through a presidency recently here where the power of the nickname, the power of belittling one through an insult gave a kind of resonance and a kind of advantage to those levying the insults and the gossip. And I read it in that way. I read the gossip around James Buchanan and William Rufus King as part of a political struggle between Buchanan and King and their many opponents, many of whom, I should say, were within their own Democratic Party. I mean, you point out Andrew Jackson. He is famous or infamous for his colorful metaphors and language. And he absolutely labeled King as an Aunt Nancy or an Aunt Fancy, to use a phrase. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Buchanan, another phrase that emerges from this period, didn't come from Jackson, but from a supporter of Jackson, also a Tennessee Democrat named Aaron Brown. He was actually communicating with Sarah Polk, the first lady to be and the wife of James Polk. So these Tennessee Democrats had it out for both Buchanan and King. But actually, a lot of the speculation in print and even in newspapers of the day that attacked Buchanan and King and figured them in this very intimate relationship that they did, in fact, share, came from opposition newspapers. Now, Buchanan and King were part of the Democratic Party. So a lot of what I found came from Whig newspapers. And in a way, like we have our partisan television stations today in news media, so too did the 19th century, where newspapers had a very clear political orientation and leaned one way or the other. And they let you know that from day one. So it would often be the Whig press, the opposition press, that would go after Buchanan and King and sort of spread this kind of image of them in different ways, whether it be making one or the other effeminate or more feminine, or attempting to poke at their bachelorhood, their never having married. And so how both these men weathered this gossip, how they weathered these insults, how they weathered and ultimately overcame all of it is, I think, the most fascinating part of all. How they were able to rise above, in a sense, what could have been a potentially very damaging and potentially career-ending kind of rumor and accusation. But instead, it seemed to me that given how 19th century sexuality worked, and I would also point out how privilege worked for these elite men who essentially had standing and power behind them, they essentially could shake off in the realm of high politics. You mentioned women. You know, it's interesting because there is more evidence of domestic partnerships of an intimate nature among women than there is among men. Famously, this is going to lead to the era of the so-called Boston marriage, where you have two lifelong unmarried women who set up housekeeping together and would share a bed, and certainly romantic feelings were involved. And yet, and yet with men, there was something of a greater distancing, it would seem, in the domestic sphere. And this, I think, gets to the gender differences between men and women and the spheres that existed between them in the 19th century. So, and that is why ultimately Buchanan and King sort of transgress, because they did live together. They did live together in a boarding house in Washington for 10 years. Yeah. And it was that period of domestic intimacy that caused and indeed produced not only their relationship, but the rumors about the relationship.
Wow, that is fascinating. And it's so interesting because, in all my research of doing these videos that I've done, you touched on a very important point. I think everybody talks about the partisan news media that we have this day and age, but the reality is that this has gone on for a long, long time in American politics. Obviously, there wasn't television news media back, then, but, with print news media, there was very much partisan, sides of things. And everybody thinks it's something that's brand new or that, former President Donald Trump, made up or something like that. But it's been going on for as long as American politics has been going on. So it's quite interesting, that you touch on that. I do have a question here for you. It says, in the introduction, you mentioned public history. If you had your choice of a president-related public history site to work at, which would you choose and why?
Wow,
it's an excellent question from Kurt. Wow. Kurt's a good grave hunter, so he's a very learned person.
Well, let me start by saying that there is no James Buchanan official presidential library. And I say official in the sense that the federal government, through the National Archives and Records Administration, NARA, does not sponsor or support presidential libraries before Herbert Hoover, which is to say, after the Hoover administration, the government finally understood that it needed to be in the business of preserving presidential papers. So from Hoover all the way now through Obama, at the present moment, we have presidential libraries that have been established. The Nixon Library is an interesting point because it took until after his death until formally it could be set up. And so it's actually came out of order. But what seems to happen is that a few years after the president has left office, his presidential library is established. Whereas the presidents before Hoover have other kinds of ways of being preserved and having their sites interpreted. And so I would answer your question by picking one of the 44 so far sites that are most associated with one of these presidents, since I would want to work at a presidential site. And certainly I want to give a shout out to Lancaster History and to the President James Buchanan's Wheatland, which is a wonderful preserved home from the time he lived there and is interpreted so skillfully by the good folks at Lancaster History. And they are in the process, in fact, of establishing, and I think have, in fact, established a James Buchanan Presidential Library. And I hope in the wisdom of time, the government will see forth to giving official status to the effort underway at Lancaster History. I visited a number of sites. I would say TJ here is our expert on any and all presidential grave sites. But actually one I think might connect to our interests and would allow me to, if I could ever secure a position there, would be to work at a site in New York City, nearby to where I live. And I think I'll just throw a bone to Grant's tomb. I think it's one of the most beautifully situated and majestic of the presidential grave sites. It allows for conversations which are ever more important about, first of all, the causes of the Civil War, Grant's heroism during it, and indeed his important 8 years presiding over Reconstruction. And I think in a way, it also tells a story in the history of New York City, a subject near and dear to my heart. So, hey, Grant's tomb it is. And if you know anyone there, let me know.
That's awesome. Yeah. Grant's tomb is one of my favorites. Grant's actually one of my favorite presidents. So that's an excellent choice. And of course, it definitely took long enough for that to get erected. So it should be one of the top ones. But very interesting. The thing I find fascinating about the Buchanan thing and the relationship with King is, how long this, the homosexual thing has lasted. It's for somebody who let's face fact, many historians consider to be, if not the worst, one of the worst presidents of all time in James Buchanan. You know, it's still there's this whole, rumor or innuendo of this homosexual relationship or him being a homosexual himself. Still, lives to this day. Because last year, when I first visited Buchanan's grave site, I noticed a rainbow flag. Somebody had put a rainbow flag at his gravesite, and of course, the rainbow flag is, the gay and lesbian communities, flag symbol of pride. And I found that interesting, and that's actually what first sparked, because I didn't really know that there was these, so-called rumors and such. So it's just amazing to me that this has kept up, for so many years. And now, of course, you write the book about it, so it's fascinating, and I am so excited to read this book and see what this relationship was like. Now, I know, correct me if I'm wrong, William Rufus King, of course, was Franklin Pierce's vice president, and he died during the Pierce administration, correct? During the Pierce presidency, isn't that correct?
Yes, I think William Rufus King may hold the record for the shortest time in office as vice president.
Yes, and I think I think you are right on that. Now, was Buchanan very distraught when King died, or did he attend the funeral down in Alabama? Did he go see? Because I know King returned to his plantation down there in Alabama for about 2 or 3 days before he actually did die when he first fell ill. Did Buchanan possibly go down there and visit him or try to? Can you tell us anything about that sort of thing?
Yeah. No, and given your expertise in presidential and vice presidential grave sites, I think it's worth noting where King is buried, and in fact a controversy that existed over where to bury him, because today his remains are interned as part of a mausoleum of sorts at Live Oak Cemetery in Selma. It's a very prominent structure within what is a very, I think, picturesque and sort of peaceful and tranquil place to lay at rest. Vice President King was only moved there, though, some decades after the fact. He was originally interred on his plantation, Kings Bend, outside of Selma. And indeed, Selma, which is now correctly mostly known and remembered in our popular imagination for its role in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King's famous march from Selma to Montgomery and being turned away, and Bloody Sunday, and all these sort of now iconic, almost mythic moments of the 20th century. Prior to then, Selma was, you might say, known best for Vice President William Rufus King. And you probably saw this from your visit, TJ. There's kind of two Selmas that are interpreted there. The antebellum Civil War era Selma, which has sites dedicated to it. There's a mansion house there that has Confederate money on display. There's other kinds of artifacts at other local museums. And then there's the interpretation of King that happens at the gravesite. King's plantation estate, his mansion, is no longer does no longer survive, number one, and is no longer available as a site for visitation. In fact, the land today is owned by a lumber company. And if there's an irony here, it's this.
Wow.
The name of the lumber company, by the way, Buchanan Lumber.
Wow. How, yeah, that is as ironic as it gets. Wow.
But it is privately held land today, and it was a cotton plantation, which, if we look at the inventory of his plantation estate book, which kept the record of the enslaved African-American people who were owned by King and his descendants, there were hundreds of slaves at the King plantation working this very rich cotton land. And cotton was the reason William Rufus King came to Alabama. He was from North Carolina. He was born in Fayetteville, in fact.
Okay.
And there is actually some King interpretation done outside the Fayetteville, Sampson County courthouse, as well as some references and records surviving at the University of North Carolina, where he attended for college. So King actually is one of these kind of Southern transplants who sees new opportunities on the horizon and in the frontier on lands that had not long ago been, in fact, held by Native peoples. And in fact, the dispossession of Native American indigenous folk from that land led the way for a different kind of agriculture and settlement. So King's entire sort of reason for being in politics, his sort of existence, was to uphold the slaveholding South. And when he was picked as vice president, I should point out, it was done because he was a representative of the slaveholding South. Pierce was a northerner from New Hampshire, and it balanced the ticket. And in a way, it was his actual state of health, his actual physical well-being was almost besides the point, because you may know this, and I'm sure you do, studying the history of the presidents, vice presidents. We've had more vice presidents die in office than you can probably count on one hand, maybe two. King is just one of them. And before the passage of the amendment to the Constitution, the 25th Amendment that laid out the succession of presidential powers, especially how to bring a new vice president, which thankfully was passed prior to Nixon's resignation and Gerald Ford's swearing in, the position just lay vacant.
Yeah.
And so Franklin Pierce operated without a vice president, without a voice in Congress during 4 difficult years. And instead of president pro tempore of the Senate, would instead reside. And in fact, King himself had been such a president pro temp of the Senate during the period when Millard Fillmore was president and had been vice president. So it's like death was and is endemic to the human condition, but it was even more so to the politics of the age. And it was almost as if the early framers of the Constitution hadn't quite figured out how to deal with it and what to do in the case of something like William Rufus King's passing.
Yeah, interesting. And that the vice presidency laid vacant until, wasn't it John Breckinridge, who was Buchanan's vice president? He took over. Yeah. So I mean, it's just fascinating. It's really interesting to you hear all these things. When I first started researching all these vice presidents and presidents, and I'd known a good amount of vice presidents, but there were some that I didn't really know much about. But looking at the history, I looked at like all these like vacancies, these presidents who didn't have vice presidents, and it was like, what? Why? And then I, of course, realized the 25th Amendment and all that kind of stuff. And it is fascinating when you really look at it. So it's quite interesting. Now, one thing, when you were doing your research, I know it's on private, land. The lumber company owns it. Now, the plantation, I know it burnt down many years ago and that sort of thing. The tomb, the graveyard, I don't know if it was a family graveyard there where King was buried, is that still like intact, or is that all like been just bulldozed over and there's nothing left?
It's a really interesting question. I actually don't know that for sure. The access road is actually gated. I did try to go down that way, and I did talk to some folks in Selma and met some folks who were really helpful in helping me to understand the lay of the land at both the Selma Dallas County Public Library, as well as I mentioned there was a museum, the Old Forge Museum, and a historic mansion, the Vanderman House, which all 3 are worth a part of a visit to Selma. And in talking to staff members there, I tried to ascertain if there was any remnant of a family cemetery or any of the plots where King descendants, as well as the enslaved of the King plantation, would have been buried. And my sense is they're likely, the remains are probably there, is what I would say to you. I don't know if the cemetery has fallen into disrepair or is not maintained. But in the case of King, it was a fortunate reinterment in that it did allow for him to be remembered in a way that he wouldn't have been had he been buried in a private cemetery, which again, over time, as the land changed hands, became part of this basically timbering operation to produce lumber. So it's a good question, and it also gets to how William Rufus King has generally been written out of American history. Again, Alabama is a great exception. Down the road, as Martin Luther King, the perhaps certainly more famous King of Selma, walked from Selma to Montgomery. Of course, he was not about to go and walk into the Alabama Department of Archives and History at that time, but certainly many scholars subsequently have. And one of the discoveries of walking around the Alabama Department of Archives and History is it also contains, really, I would almost call them relics or surviving artifacts. And one of them, one set of them, I should say, has been made into a memorial room dedicated to William Rufus King.
Oh,
And the
wow.
King Memorial Room contains really all the treasures that the archives has been able to obtain through the years of King's life, including examples of his silverware and china set, and some maps of the King's Bend plantation and how massive it was, other artwork and images about King, as well as some interpretive panels about his life. And really that room in the archives in Montgomery, which is definitely worth a visit when you do go into Montgomery for research or for visiting, is really the best place to learn about his life in a kind of interpretive public history way. Besides, as I said, a few signs here and there. Now, that's just from a kind of interpretive or public history perspective. Besides my book, I relied upon a number of really good sources about him. Nothing as long as what I've written just yet, but there was a series of articles written by King, published some decades ago. And there is a scholar who is working today on a new biography of King alone. And I have to say his book, when it comes out, and I think it will in some time with the University of Alabama Press, fingers crossed, will even put more of a spotlight on his life, and we'll look at King's entire life story. And we'll use really the same sources that I had access to, but for one difference. This scholar about whom I'm talking, he is in fact an Alabama resident, unlike me. I came as a visitor and learned what I could. And he actually has, through the years, in fact, had bequeathed to him a portrait of Vice President King that he has in his possession and in his own home today.
Wow.
And there are many images of William Rufus King. So many, in fact, that it's been something of a kind of running joke in my book that he's not only forgotten, but he's been misfigured. As you were to Google William Rufus King today, one of the images that comes up is very commonly on websites all across the internet is actually not a picture of William Rufus King, but the New York politician Fernando Wood.
Wow, really?
And so it's to the point where we're so kind of, we don't even know who he is. We don't even know what he looks like. I mean, historians do, but it's just the kind of the errors, I guess I would say, made along the way. TJ, gets to your point. How is it that we're left with an interpretation that says James Buchanan and William Rufus King were gay lovers, and that's what we've got?
Yeah.
It's just letting the evidence kind of point you, and you say, well, then this is my conclusion. And it ends up being the same story. Has the careful research been done? Has the hard work of going to archives and talking and reading to historians, has that been done? And so you've got to ask yourself when you read stuff out there, because you could right now go and say James Buchanan gay, get ready. It's going to blow up your feed for a while.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. And to that point, when I've been doing these videos, of course, like I said, I'm not a historian. I didn't go to school for history or anything like that, but I'm definitely a student of history, and I love to learn as much as I can, as often as I can. And researching this, I've had several really good, nice people who have reached out to me and said, hey, by the way, in your video about this, just to let you know, this was wrong. And I've realized that I'm going to have to go back eventually and do kind of like an errors and omissions little video to kind of correct some things. And it's amazing the amount of misinformation that you find. I mean, we all know that about the internet, but like you would think on some things like historical, even if it's just dates or like you just touched on photographs. I believe there was a photograph I used for Andrew Jackson's parents, and it turned out that this website claimed it was his parents. It's not his parents. So it's just, one of those kind of things where you really truly do. And now what I try to do is I try to like find 7, 8, 9 different sources that are telling me the same information before I obviously make my videos and then, put that out there to the public. Because again, I'm not a historian, but I also don't want to give misinformation or false information out. And there is a lot of it, as you just touched on. So that's incredible about King's. Now, if you remember off the top of your head, did I use that photo in question in my slides?
No, you didn't. Good for you.
Good. That's a good thing. So we have a few people. A few people were commented about Reagan. Would love to be at the Reagan Library. To that question that was asked to you, Mount Vernon. A few other people. Hi, Gracie. Hi, Natalie. A bunch of people just chiming in here. So, a question for you now, as far as presidential grave sites and presidential, even vice presidential grave sites. Have you visited many of these grave sites and that sort of thing, or have you only visited a handful? Because I always find that fascinating. Like, last year when I did what I did, it was basically, of course, due to the pandemic, I had time and I had extra money and I had, I was bored. And so I figured, what can I do with my time? So I literally drove to 33 different states over 40,000 miles, visiting all these grave sites by myself. And, there's a lot of people that have done these over the years, but that's exactly the point. It usually takes several years, if not even like a decade, to obtain all these. I did it in such a amount of time, which was crazy, to be honest. But so yeah, that question to you: have you visited many vice president and presidential grave sites, or just a handful?
I think I'm falling in the handful category. The ones I've been to have been memorable, and like you, I will go out of my way if I ever have the possibility to visit one. That's why I found your videos so interesting, because you actually are bringing to light interpretation around so many of these sites. I mean, the probably the ones that we don't even sometimes think about as being memorials to certain presidents, they're not exactly their grave sites. I mean, people say, well, the Lincoln Memorial, perhaps the most famous memorial of them all, or the Washington Monument. I mean, these are two very prominent, unmissable sites within Washington, D.C. And yet, of course, neither are grave sites to our two of our greatest presidents. You'd have to go over to Mount Vernon and the case of Springfield, two places I have been at least, to see these really impressive sites. And the Lincoln one, I mean, stands out to me as monumental. But at the same time, we tend to instead focus less, I think, on the site itself. I mean, the Buchanan, just again, another one, the Buchanan gravesite is within Wood Hill Cemetery in Lancaster. It's this one of several historic cemeteries. It is prominently positioned on the hill. You kind of can't miss it once you go into it, but it's not its own thing. I mean, it's not a Grant's tomb or McKinley's imposing and impressive monument as well. And I should say that how we honor some of our lesser known presidents in terms of the grave sites sort of reflects in a way the same problem and challenge with not having NARA, NARA funding for these same sites. Like Herbert Hoover. When I was out, I did a road trip with my parents. We went, I called the Midwestern Circle Swing. We were starting in Chicago, went down and visited a number of national park sites. So ending up in West Branch, Iowa, you pull into the Herbert Hoover site, which is this interesting interpretation of his life. It's got a wonderful museum. And the Hoover burial site is just sort of around the corner up the hill there with Herbert and Lou Hoover buried side by side in a very sort of nice, I thought, touching kind of way. And yet it's because the National Archives essentially administers that site that Herbert Hoover has, I think, had justice to him in his resting place. And that just wasn't the case. Even with his direct predecessor, like Calvin Coolidge, you go up to Plymouth Notch, and it's just this
roadside grave.
It's amazing. I mean, that reflects in a lot of ways Coolidge the man. So I haven't been to all of them. I know about most of them. I've read about them, and I've enjoyed some of your videos. So I would almost just ask you a question, if I might, what's been one of your favorite sites that you've gone to?
It's interesting. It's a great question. I actually did a presentation about what I did last year for both Rowan University and Rutgers University here in New Jersey. And the really interesting thing was I kind of did like a top 5 of both vice presidents and presidents' grave sites, in my own opinion. And actually, my number 1 vice president grave site is William Rufus King. That was my favorite, believe it or not. Ironically. So it's very ironic that we're speaking about this, because the thing that I loved about William Rufus King's was I just loved the cemetery just screamed like Southern plantation to me, like that, the Spanish moss, like coming off the trees. Like it had such a Southern charm to it. And I felt like it was like, wow, I feel like I'm back in the 1800s, around the corner from a Southern plantation. So I loved it. And that was definitely my favorite of the vice presidents. As far as presidents go, Kurt actually is chiming in. He's a gentleman who has seen all of the vice president and presidential grave sites as well. It's taken him several years. He started when he was a very young kid, 8 or 9 years old, actually. And he's a very, very learned person, especially when it comes to this sort of thing. And he was saying the Garfield tomb in Cleveland is his favorite. Now, the Garfield tomb in Cleveland, unfortunately, I'm actually going to be doing my video for Garfield for next week. It's released here soon. And I was there in Cleveland at Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, but unfortunately, everything last year was closed due to COVID. So the not only was the tomb closed for COVID, but they were also doing renovations on Garfield's tomb. So I wasn't able to get inside, unfortunately, which is a bummer because it's the only presidential casket that's on display out of all of them. So inside the tomb. So it's really, really cool. I've seen pictures. So I understand why he says that's his favorite. As far as mine, it has to be Lincoln. And the reason that it's Lincoln is not just because of the man. We all know the legendary status, of course, of the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, but it's also because I had such a unique experience. Doing this last year during COVID, yes, I ran into obstacles of things being closed, but I also ran into things that no one really experiences, and that is having these places all to myself. That was the very unique experience that I had. For example, Mount Vernon was closed for about 2 months or so due to COVID when the pandemic first started last year. And then it reopened. And the day after it reopened, I drove down there. It was like a Wednesday. Well, the day after it reopened, it was a Wednesday. Everybody is still basically inside due to COVID. I literally had the grounds of Mount Vernon to myself, which is not something, as you visited there. You go on a normal summer day and there's 100 to 200 people walking around the grounds of Mount Vernon. So Lincoln's tomb was another one of those very unique circumstances. They were only allowing a certain number of people inside the tomb at a time due to COVID, social distancing restrictions. Right. I showed up at 3:45 in the afternoon. The last tour they were letting in was at 4 p.m. I just made it. And I was the only person there that was solo, that was alone. So the tour guide, he let everybody go in. They didn't go in with us, the tour guide. They just stood outside the tomb. And at the end, I was just outside looking around. He looks at me and kind of smiles and says, "Enjoy this because you now have the tomb all to yourself." So I literally walked inside of Lincoln's tomb, walked down that long marble hallway by myself. And, you turn the corner, for anybody that doesn't know, you go down a long hallway and you turn this corner and there's the sarcophagus of Abraham Lincoln. And I mean, even right now, the hairs are standing up on my arms because it was just so unbelievable that I was like, I'm in here by myself. I'm sure at any given time, there's several other people in there with you, tourists and stuff looking around. So it was quite a unique experience and something that I will never forget. So that really does stick out in my head and it's definitely my favorite. Anybody that has not seen, I would say there's probably 3 presidents you should go see if possible. Probably maybe even 4 if you want to include Garfield or Grant in that spectrum, but definitely Washington, Lincoln, and to me, Kennedy, of course, the eternal flame there in Arlington. So, a very special place. So, but yeah. So that's interesting, and I thought about it earlier today. I'm like, wow, William Rufus King was my favorite vice president gravesite. So it's really cool that I'm going to be talking to Thomas tonight about this. We have another question for you, actually. Okay. Is there a vice president apart from William Rufus King that you think merits an updated analytical biography?
Well, I've written about the vice presidents, and I've studied them both through the lens of William Rufus King as well as more generally. And I've even written about it during the presidential campaign season and thinking about the selection of Kamala Harris as a vice president. in that process, I picked out really some folks who I thought were really prominent and excellent vice presidents, and what they had in common generally and almost unfairly, and this gets to Joe Biden in a way, is they went on and became president. So on the one hand, I want to avoid answering the question by any vice president who became president. Let's start with that. But of the vice presidents who are in the category of never having become president, or who at least had some time in office, and I think that would be, again, not as opposed to vice presidential candidates who never made it. I think there's some room for further analysis on some of the early vice presidents. These are generally figures who are, like William Rufus King, are lesser known. It's not to say that there hasn't been some biographical work. Like, I think about Grant's vice president in his second term, Henry Wilson. There has been a study of him, which is quite good. Again, but another sort of overlooked figure, I think, importantly, to how he solidified the Republican support in New England around Grant in the 72 campaign. And that's often how they are looked at. Looked at as what kind of, power do they bring to the ticket, and less on their individual kind of merits. Like Wilson, for example, is an abolitionist before the Civil War from Massachusetts, and often is right over there across the aisle from Charles Sumner, delivering orations against the slave power. So I think someone like that stands out as sort of overlooked, not so much requiring, I think, a new biography. It's just, again, needs to be part of the narrative. If there is someone, a vice president, I think, that, again, doesn't become a president and plays an important role in more recent history, and I think in many ways is the start of the modern vice presidency, it's Walter Mondale. And he is still, thankfully, alive and with us.
Still alive, yeah. He's what, like 94 or something like that?
I'm shocked there has not been a biography of Mondale that incorporates oral history. There just hasn't. There's been books about his contribution to generally the tradition of liberalism. Of course, he runs in 84, so he's got that, sort of prominence as well. But, there was a recent series about the vice presidents on CNN, and I was keen to watch it. Yeah. And they interview Mondale, and he has an understanding of the significance of his time under Carter as having pioneered the modern vice presidency. Yeah. So as I say, I think he's due for a reinterpretation, and I hope there's someone out there working on it, because, again, we still have Vice President Mondale, fortunately, with us.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Yeah, because Mondale, I watching that CNN thing, and then I watched another live stream not too long ago with several historians, and Mondale's name came up, and how significant his role was with the Carter administration. Of course, President Jimmy Carter, he leaned on Walter Mondale a lot with a lot of different issues and things. So he definitely did shape what the vice presidency role has become. There's no doubt about that. So let me see if there's anything else here with these guys. No, not yet. So I actually wanted to, if it's okay with you, I wanted to get into kind of a little bit of a ranking of what you think. Now, I think it would be too long for us to go through every single one, but if you could give me, and I want to start with you with vice presidents, because you're very, very learned on the topic of vice presidents as well. If you could give me a top three of what you would consider the worst or most detrimental vice presidents that we've ever seen in office, and then if you can give me kind of a top three of what you would consider the best, or even like somebody like Mondale, somebody that's underwhelmingly not mentioned often enough type thing. If you can give me that, I would love to hear what your take is on something like that.
That's really a good point. And as I said, TJ, I've actually written about this topic. So I would encourage people to check out an article I wrote last summer for CNN called "The Best and Worst VP Picks." So they can read my reasonings for it, but that way I'll allow us to have a bit of a conversation with the audience tonight. For the best in chronological order, not so much in terms of merit, I listed John Adams, Vice President to George Washington. I listed Theodore Roosevelt, Vice President to McKinley. And I listed George H.W. Bush, Vice President to Ronald Reagan. Now, the thing about my bad list was I had to pick vice presidents again who I was trying to avoid just vice presidents who became presidents, unless I thought essentially they're so associated with it. So you might not like my bad list because I do start with Aaron Burr. I have him on my truly awful vice presidents.
Okay.
But number 2, and this is something, again, take me to task if you like, but I have Andrew Johnson as the worst, which again, we know he's only vice president for a short time, but it's hard for me to disentangle that from the fact that he was such a terrible president. And lastly, I have Spiro Agnew.
Oh, yes. That's a good choice because, reading a lot about Agnew, and it's interesting. Agnew, so he has one of the most underwhelming grave sites you will ever see for a historical, political figure, especially somebody as high as Vice President of the United States. In Maryland, I mean, his gravesite is literally just a little placard on the ground, and all it says is Agnew. And then it just says, Spiro T. It has no mention of him being vice president. It has no real significance as far as any symbolism of anything American flag or anything like that. Very, very underwhelming. The only thing that you really would know is when I was there was a few American flags, tiny ones that somebody had put around it. Other than that, there was nothing indicating. So, and Aaron Burr, it's funny that you mentioned him because, of course, he's buried down in Princeton, New Jersey. He's actually buried only about 50 yards from the man who did 2 non-consecutive terms, the only man to do that, Grover Cleveland. And right next to Aaron Burr is actually John Witherspoon, who is a Declaration of Independence signer. So quite fascinating. And then, of course, the famous Burr-Hamilton duel happened right underneath the cliffs in Weehawken, New Jersey. So, a lot of Burr history here in New Jersey, of course. Now, I must ask, when it comes to Johnson, I understand why you pick him. I understand, of course, to much of an extent why you picked Burr. Is Agnew based upon not only his role when he was vice president, but all the scandal and such even after he was out of office and that sort of thing? Because I know there was a lot of scandal and stuff that surrounded him even after he was out of office. So what do you take? Do you just go by their time as vice president, or do you kind of take everything into account based upon any sort of corruption or scandal that surrounded them?
Yeah, that's a good point, because although Agnew was corrupt, let's be clear, there were other corrupt vice presidents, particularly in the 19th century. Schuyler Colfax, Grant's first vice president, for example, was implicated in charges of corruption. That's why Grant actually dropped him from the ticket in 72. Agnew, on the other hand, kind of doubled down. And it's interesting, he took this sort of belligerent approach, almost abusive approach to his dealings with the press. And ultimately, his falling out stemmed from the fact that he could not continue to have the support of Richard Nixon. Now, he's not involved in the Watergate scandal. He resigns vice president because of essentially bribery schemes that he was involved with back in Maryland. And it's petty corruption of the kind that isn't really, unfortunately, part of our American politics, but that we hold our presidents and vice presidents to a higher task. And yes, later on, he faces criminal charges, is in fact found guilty, will have to serve time. And for all these reasons, he stands out as sort of the worst among us and our impulses in our politics. That being said, we mentioned here, we're on a YouTube channel, social media. Sometimes these figures have a second afterlife. One of my favorite accounts to follow on Twitter, and please, everyone, check me out at T. Balcerski. But also, while you're at it, check out Spiro Agnew's Ghost, because it's a really wonderful Twitter account. More of a political commentary. And there are some great avatars out there on Twitter of presidents who accounts are almost fan accounts, but sometimes they'll speak in the voice or in the tone of the presidents. And so again, to your point, while many of these presidents and vice presidents have passed away, they live on in Twitter.
Yes. They live on social media. And Thomas, I definitely, you'll have to get me that link to that CNN article that you did, because I definitely want to. I'm going to put that link to that CNN article down below in the description of this live stream after we're done tonight. And I'll also be putting the link to your social media accounts like Twitter and that sort of thing. So, guys, definitely go check out Thomas, because he's definitely fascinating and knows his stuff, as you can tell. It's funny, we touched on one of the vice presidents that I've always felt, just really just an overall good human being, and that's Henry Wilson. Henry Wilson was a good man, and it's interestingly enough that when I went to go see his gravesite surprised me almost more than anyone's, because he's buried in Massachusetts, of course, small town, small cemetery. It's not even paved. I think it was just dirt roads and such through this smaller cemetery. And he's buried kind of in the back, like it's a wooded cemetery. It's kind of sits back in the woods. And his headstone and such literally had moss and things growing on it. Like, it looks like it has not. And it goes to touch on what we spoke about these, the funding and things, that there's nobody, preserves these places or really does anything to memorialize these people. And I found that, of course, much more with vice presidents than I did presidents. And then don't even get me started with Declaration signers or U.S. Constitution signers, because some of those gravesites are unbelievably just bad. But yeah, I mean, it was really shocking. Henry Wilson's, had moss on it and such. It looks like it had not been visited or maintained or preserved in probably literally decades. It was really sad to see. And it's a shame, because no one, unless you're a history major, like one of your students or somebody like that that's really into history, a lot of younger kids, coming through high school and that sort of thing, they don't even probably know who Henry Wilson is. And, he is an interesting man. And, if anybody ever went and saw his gravesite, they'd be like, this guy, there's no way he was vice president. Look at his gravesite. It's just amazing when you see. That's what fascinated with what I did. I found it interesting when I was, the research that I did of going to these gravesites, how obscure some of these sites were and how forgotten some of these sites are, and how underwhelming and, not well maintained or preserved. And it almost, and it speaks to what you said, of course, about the funding and that sort of thing, but also how with presidents, you can kind of see how almost like the public at the time, felt about these presidents, like how they wanted to remember these men. And, you get these grand, huge monuments like McKinley and Garfield and Grant and those kind of guys. And then you get somebody like Buchanan, and it's like, you wouldn't even know it's really a president's gravesite until you walk up to it. There's really not much to it, as you know. So it's just quite interesting how you see that contrast. And I think it does speak to not only the funding aspect that you had touched on, but also kind of just what the overall sentiment has been even since their death, as to, how can we better memorialize or remember these people? And it really has kind of fallen by the wayside with a lot of them, unfortunately.
Well, and the passage of time, that would be the other part of it. And as someone who teaches early American history, to your point about does a student today know Henry Wilson's name? No. And I really don't have a problem with that, because he's not part of the living memory anymore of the United States. And second, and as sort of a second point, I would say why I'm sort of less troubled is that these were sort of politicians we might even call statesmen of an era of sort of plain republicanism, lowercase r, where they really did not believe in the fame and the fortune and the kind of sort of legacy that we now bestow upon our leaders, that is almost, to me, verges on a kind of hero worship that we do still engage in, I think, ritualistically with some of our earlier presidents like a Lincoln or a Washington. And it can sometimes, therefore, obscure engagement with the real man behind the picture or behind the portrait. And in terms of why certain VPs will remain sort of obscure and forgotten, it should be pointed out even in their own time, they were that way. Let's not forget the famous admonition of John Nance Garner, who served 2 terms as vice president under one of the most powerful presidents in our history, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who declared that the vice presidency wasn't worth a bucket of warm, well,
yeah,
something.
And FDR, unfortunately, that's probably one of the biggest downfalls, at least in my opinion, of President Franklin Roosevelt and even President Lincoln. It's almost like it's not that they felt this way, outwardly, but it's almost like they had this thing about them, like they were immortal, like they were always just going to continue on and be president, and they really, left their vice presidents very much blind as to really what the administration was focusing on or what direction it was going in. And I know Andrew Johnson was a complete disaster, so I'm not giving him any sort of pass in any way, shape, or form. But he truly did, when Lincoln was assassinated, as you well know, and many historians, of course, know, he had no idea what the plan for Reconstruction was. He had no idea what President Lincoln really had or what vision he had for Reconstruction. So, and even, FDR, when he died in office, when Truman took over, Truman was like, what do I do? And, there's that famous quote of Eleanor Roosevelt that, she said to Truman, if is there anything I can do? And she said, if there's anything we can do, you're going to need all the help now. So, it's like, and of course he was left with probably the hardest and toughest decision of any president in the history of our country, possibly with, dropping the atomic bomb during the war. So it's just quite interesting. Yeah, it's really fascinating to me. Now, I know we've gone an hour. I'm fine if you're fine to continue on a little bit. Are you okay here, Thomas? Or
well, unlike Truman, who, when he learned that FDR had died, said all the stars had fallen upon him, I feel invigorated by our conversation. No stars have fallen upon me, no planets, no moons. So yeah, we keep going.
All right, great. So now we touched on vice presidents a bit. Now, what about presidents? There's so much, and it's funny. I'm 40 years old. I'll be 41 here in a few weeks in April, and I of course I remember Reagan because he served 2 terms, and I started to really remember things when I was about 8 years old and beyond. I could kind of really have a recollection of things. So I remember Reagan fairly well. Remember Bush. I remember, of course, Desert Storm and that war and that sort of thing. So I remember pretty much all the presidents of my lifetime. And it seems that even in my lifetime, we've kind of gone, and I think social media has a huge impact on this, and tell me what your opinion is, of we've kind of gone to where even if you don't agree with their politics, there was still kind of a respect that was surrounded around the office of presidency. With Reagan, even with, George H.W. Bush, there was still this respect. And I feel like over the last 15 to 20 years, there seems to be this big shift where maybe it's because everybody has a voice and they can just be on social media and tell us what they think. But I feel like there is kind of this sentiment where there's not as much respect for the office of presidency anymore as maybe there even was 20, 25 years ago. And of course, many decades ago. Do you feel that is true? And if it is true, is it because social media exists so heavily now? Or, what do you feel about that sort of thing?
Well, TJ, it's a great question, since it gets us back to where we were earlier, thinking about the role of media. And I think there is a way in which we finger media today as kind of culprits, as if somehow the messengers are being shot, literally, and as somehow they're to blame. But I would say media is simply a representation of the desires and demands of an American people and how they wish to consume news. News, whether it be way back in the 1800s through print, or today through mostly now it seems internet consumption, news has always been contested and has always been challenged and in many ways partisan. The question you're getting at, though, is less about the partisan nature of media and media consumption, and more about the way in which we now can be more critical of our political leaders, and it would seem can use those channels to air those political grievances and disputes. And more than that, at the detriment of politics itself, to the detriment of the passage of legislation, to the detriment of the functioning of the government. and to progress writ large. And, if you want to take a partisan lens in our own time, you can point to how in the period following Ronald Reagan, and particularly, I would say, during the Bill Clinton presidency, the hyper-partisanship through cable news media seems to have led to the current situation we're in. And I agree with you. I'm born in 1982. I've lived through the same period. There was a pivot point in the mid-1990s, I think, towards a more sort of confrontational, aggressive, loud, toxic kind of politics that no longer had deference. That being said, if you were to go back to the antebellum period, to the presidency of James Buchanan, which I'm most familiar with, Southern states who seceded from the Union were taking an action on a level and in a kind of way that it maybe was masked in chivalry and gentlemanly conduct and respect for the Constitution to a point, but breaking up the Union, forming a new nation, building an entire kind of worldview on the subjugation of African American people. It seems to me that we may have had better manners back then, but we're way more progressive now.
Yeah.
And the polity has expanded. We are a more multiracial, multi-ethnic. We have more women, more LGBTQ people in politics. It's the most diverse our politics has ever been. So we're way less monolithic than the period we sometimes pine to and almost are nostalgic for. And as such, I think the disagreements and the tensions have become more palpable, more real, and more heated.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent point. I definitely agree with everything you said. It's created. I think you used the word toxic, and I think it has. I think it's created almost a toxic kind of environment and outlook when it comes to politics this day and age. And I don't think it's anything that is going to get the job done, so to speak. So I hope that's at some point things tend to calm down or maybe shift a little bit when it comes to that. I don't see it happening because I think social media and that sort of thing and people's voices and being able to air their grievances, as you said, becomes more and more and more prevalent, as we go on. It just seems to be going kind of crazy. But now I have to ask, since you're a James Buchanan expert, is he the worst, or is Andrew Johnson the worst? I mean, who do you consider to probably be what you would consider the worst president that we've ever had?
Wow, you're using the W word.
Yeah, because you have to, or at least the maybe, if you want to say in a nice way, the least successful president that we've ever had.
No, worst is fine, and there's no getting around how we rate and rank the presidents. I think it's a game. Let's start with that. Okay. And it's a game that people like me and who sit in offices like this play. We love to study American history. We spend our lifetimes engaging in debate and scholarship and argument around it. So when it comes down to how historians have fun, we sometimes like to have fun with the equivalent of a parlor game. That is to say, rating and ranking the U.S. presidents. And even the history of rating and ranking the presidents goes back to the 1940s, to a father-son team of Arthur Schlesinger Sr. and Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who both prominent historians. Both Jr. was very prominent even within the Kennedy administration as the official chronicler of that presidency. And in fact, the Schlesinger's impulse was to, I think, historicize first Franklin Delano's Franklin Delano Roosevelt's unprecedented 4 terms, and after Schlesinger Jr.'s term to kind of assess Kennedy's ranking. So the very first 2 rankings were after Roosevelt and Kennedy. It's become more formalized since the 1980s. You've got Siena College running a survey now. You have a C-SPAN having run one since 2001. The New York Times got in the game. There's a number of other institutes that run surveys, and there's even surveys of the first ladies and the vice presidents. I've participated in one such survey so far about the first ladies. And knowing how ratings and rankings are done, it isn't just completely arbitrary. You don't just write 1 through 45, as the case may be, on a list. You actually have to fill out a rubric of different characteristics or traits of the various presidents. And how those questions and traits are asked, I think, leads to an answer that does put James Buchanan in last place. We can get to why that is, because he is more or less successful than some presidents in certain categories. But the thing that is most compelling to the ratings and rankings, the thing that counts for the most, is character.
Mm-hmm.
And Buchanan's character has been held to account in his handling of the secession crisis of 1860 to 1861, when the Union fell apart. And I think psychologically, there is another factor at work. And that is, once you're in the basement of history, it's hard to get up the stairs to a higher level of the house. And when at the very peak, at the roof, sits Abraham Lincoln, you're going to stay way below that for a long time. And it's not, I think, not for good reason that both Buchanan and Andrew Johnson, on either side of Lincoln's towering shadow, are the two presidents routinely ranked worst and second worst.
Yeah.
And so, will Buchanan rise in the rankings? It's something of an interesting question, since over the last 4 years of the Trump presidency, and even in the most recent months of the Biden presidency, we've read countless pieces by editorialists and prognosticators making the claim that Trump should be considered the worst president, and sort of going at it by way of James Buchanan. I've seen a few of those articles. And it's, in a way, it's sort of bad history, because it's sort of using history sort of, I think, for a partisan angle. And it doesn't actually take into account that part of what allows for historians to make critical judgments is distance, is critical distance, is the passage of time. It's not to say that President Trump in our lifetimes won't be ranked at the bottom of the pack. It remains to be seen.
Of course.
But it became something of a tool of, I think, partisanship to make such a claim by way of James Buchanan. So I personally don't think James Buchanan belongs as our worst president. I think there are several presidents who should be ranked worse than him. But I also think it's interesting that this conversation's even happening, and it's become even more relevant in light of the Trump presidency.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. And I have seen a few of those articles where Buchanan's name is mentioned, in a Trump article about being the worst. Now, as far as Buchanan goes, now he was engaged, right, to, was it Ann Coleman? Was that her name? Now, because I know she died very, very suspiciously. Now, I mean, there is some speculation about suicide, possibly, or now, in all your research, what have you found out regarding Ann Coleman? Was it suicide? If it was suicide, was it due to the relationship with Buchanan that ended, or maybe possible rumors surrounding why the relationship ended? Can you fill me in and shed some light on her and her kind of bizarre and strange death?
Yeah, so here's a case where I definitely relied upon the scholarship of other historians in addition to doing my own research. But the historian and biographer of James Buchanan, Philip Klein, wrote what is still, I think, the work about President Buchanan. And although I would love for readers to pick up my book, Phil Klein's President James Buchanan still holds up as the most detailed and, I think, a well-researched account of his life. And I built upon Klein's research. And in this specific topic, I was dogged in trying to find every bit of research that Klein had. And unfortunately, there are some documents that Klein had access to in the 1950s and 60s when he was researching James Buchanan that are no longer preserved. And it's a shame, because they actually speak, apparently, to firsthand accounts of Ann Coleman as she appeared in Philadelphia on the eve of her death, as she was, in fact, examined by a physician. So we don't have that diary entry, unfortunately, but what we have is Klein's excerpt of it, which really does speak to the physical appearance of Ann Coleman as she was on her deathbed. And in fact, Klein, the historian, and Updike, whom I mentioned earlier, the novelist and writer about Buchanan, corresponded, and their correspondence survives as well. And both of them kind of talk about suicide as a possible motive here. But I think especially in our modern day of the opiate crisis and our knowledge of how opiates can be easily and accidentally overdosed, she most likely took laudanum, which is an opiate, and in high doses could be and is in fact lethal to the human body. In low doses can be a pain reliever of sort on a par with morphine. And it's, in my view, likely that in her distraught state and in her condition, which was potentially psychologically unwell at the time, she overdosed on laudanum. But I think of it as an accidental overdose. I think she had a lot to live for. She was a young woman. She was 24. And yes, while she had a break with her fiance, James Buchanan, there wasn't anything to say that she couldn't overcome this. She was in the presence of her sister. They were out in Philadelphia to try to relieve her suffering from the breakup. And I think it's one of these things where we still ask our people today who sadly suffer from mental health problems and who contemplate suicide. When you talk to people who survive attempts, they talk about that moment where they know they don't want to die. And I just have to think that Ann Coleman would have experienced those same emotions because it's so common among survivors. And unfortunately, she did die.
Yeah, that's interesting. And she also, correct me if I'm wrong, she came from a very prominent family, right? Wasn't her family pretty wealthy and well off?
The Colemans, Robert Coleman, her father, was an iron master. He controlled iron mines in Pennsylvania, and he was considered the wealthiest man in Lancaster.
Wow.
And which made her quite the prize for James Buchanan as a wife. So the fact that she actually ended the relationship with him, the engagement, which itself was over a misunderstanding, but the best evidence there suggests that Buchanan, in his legal work, neglected Ann Coleman. And in the process, he was traveling back and forth between Philadelphia and Lancaster, conducting legal business, building his profession. And when he returned on one occasion from his business trip in Philadelphia from abroad, you might say, he came back to Lancaster and paid a call at the house of one of his friends whose sister was there. His wife's sister, so an acquaintance or another eligible woman in Lancaster anyway. And word got back to Ann Coleman that Buchanan had spent the hour sort of socializing, one could almost say flirting, with this sister of his friend's wife. And there's another story. It's a little difficult to know how true it is that he learned that Ann Coleman had broken off the engagement by a note that was handed to him while he was arguing a case before a judge, and his face, the story goes, was observed to turn ashen as he recognized that it was over between he and his fiancée.
That's really fascinating. That's interesting. Now, speaking of stories with Buchanan, is the story of what he said to Lincoln on his way out of office? Is that true? About if you're as happy coming in as I am going out, you're the happiest man in the world. Is that factual? That little quote there?
Yeah, it is. Buchanan himself wrote that he said it to Lincoln, and we have multiple accounts that more or less you're paraphrasing, but it's right on point. And the reality is Buchanan himself was a student of history, and I think his favorite president was George Washington. So he would have known that Washington uttered a similar sentiment to John Adams. I'm fairly out, you're fairly in. Let's see who of us is the happier. And I think Buchanan said what he did to Lincoln almost as tradition. And I don't know for sure that there weren't other presidents who said something similar. But I think Buchanan was building upon his knowledge of Washington's transition to Adams and was doing so almost by paying respect to the process of presidential transition and ensuring that it was a smooth and amicable one. Interesting.
That's fascinating. I like that. So now I have to ask, since we asked you about your top vice presidents and worst vice, we got to do presidents now. So give me a little top three of the worst in your opinion, and then the best. And I will say, even if it would make your top three, I think we probably should omit former President Donald Trump, just because it's still so new. And I think it kind of takes, at least in my opinion, a little bit of time for these gentlemen to be out of office before we really can truly rank them in history as to where they land. So I don't think it would be completely fair to rank him one way or the other, at least in my opinion. So if you can, if he was going to be in there, try to omit him and let's see what you come up with.
Okay. So as I said, I haven't written a piece about the top 3 presidents and top 3 bottom and top presidents, I should say, but I have thought about this question very much myself, and I've dwelt more in the basement, as I say, because this is where Buchanan is. So I'll start with where I think I've given a more studied approach to the worst presidents. And since I think here there has been more work and debate on the actual rankings, I will actually try to give you a specific ranking from third to last, second to last, and worst.
Okay.
So I would say about the worst president in American history, I think you maybe saw this coming, and your readers might as well, is Andrew Johnson. And I would put him dead last. And from him, I think it's quite a big leap to the next worst president, who I'm going to put as Franklin Pierce. And I would closely put behind Pierce in third to last James Buchanan.
Okay.
So 2 presidents, again, 2 immediately preceding Lincoln, 1 after Lincoln, involved again in sort of the most difficult problems of perhaps American history, the issue of slavery and Reconstruction, respectively. And they do such a poor job really handling those issues. Yeah.
Now, I'm going to throw a little curveball at you, Thomas. I am. Who would you consider, just give me one, to be the most overrated president in the history of our country, that maybe it could be somebody that we even memorialize, in this great, vein and that sort of thing. But who would you consider to be probably the most overrated that we've ever seen?
Hands down, John F. Kennedy.
Interesting. Okay. I had a feeling you were going to say
he is the most overrated president, and it has everything to do with the circumstance of his presidency, and particularly his death. Look, we're in a generational shift here from your and my parents and grandparents to our generation here, which is going to, and I've already seen it, by the way, with my students. They objectively do not feel attached to John F. Kennedy the same way the older generation does. And so this is actually not to say he isn't, I would call him a near great president, but I would say he is the most overrated president, hands down. And he will, in fact, fall in the rankings, I think, with the passage of time. Again, overrated. It's not to say that he isn't, he's often in the top 5 or top 10 in American history. And I think I just don't think he stands that high. So that's my answer. And it's an unpopular one, I'm sure, even with your listeners.
I mean, he's one of my favorites, I'll be honest. But in fairness, my father, he idolized John F. Kennedy. But again, my father just passed a month ago. He was 69 years old. He grew up, and he was only 12 years old when Kennedy was assassinated. So he grew up with Kennedy. My father was an Irish Catholic boy from New Jersey. So, Kennedy, Irish Catholic, there was that big thing there. And I had a feeling you were probably going to say Kennedy, to be honest. And I can't really disagree, because I think with Kennedy, at least in my opinion, and I'm not such a learned historian such as yourself, but Kennedy really has become this larger than life figure, and I think really it's because of the way he died, as you touched on. The assassination made him so immortal, so to speak. Now, I think that Kennedy was probably one of our greatest presidential speakers. He definitely was one of the greatest speakers that we've ever had. But as far as a lot of things surrounding his presidency, and of course, like you said, how he got elected, there definitely was a lot of controversy there. So I can't disagree. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. It's now in the same vein, because I want to let you finish your point too. Would you have an underrated one, the most underrated, who you think doesn't get enough credit?
Well, I've already moved James Buchanan up 2 ranks, so I mean, that is to go from last place to anything but last place. I think would suggest I think he's underrated, but
Okay.
not nearly as underrated as the person I'm about to say. I think the most underrated president in American history is Ulysses S. Grant. And it reflects even in his very low ranking in the very first poll of the Schlesingers from 1948. He was dead last. And he was even behind Buchanan.
Wow. Is
the
that
Grant
because
presidency has been pilloried.
Yeah. Is that mainly because of the whole scandal and everything in his cabinet? Is that really kind of why there's such a black eye on his presidency, you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's everything to do with I think the telling of history. And I think it gets to something we've been talking about is the backlash against Reconstruction and the onset of civil rights for African American people in the South. The Grant administration fought hard to, whenever it could feasibly, preserve and protect the voting rights, the civil rights of Black people in the South for 8 long years. It passed 2 major constitutional amendments. It reconstructed the South. It brought the Republican Party to the South. And Black people held office in numbers that they would not hold again until the 1970s in the South. And we're still in Georgia. We've elected only our first Black senator in history.
Absolutely,
It has been a convenient part of forgetting, and I would argue the lost cause mythology, to throw Grant's presidency under the bus and to remember him only as a great general and to remember him only as the hero of Appomattox, and to allow a kind of reconciliation and reunion narrative, even on the day of the opening of Grant's tomb, when former Confederate soldiers shake hands with former Union soldiers. And it seems to me in the process, Grant's presidency and all the good it did was then just stained as a corrupt administration, while he might be personally honest, that had no merit or anything worth remembering. But he passed and he enforced the Ku Klux Klan Act. He destroyed the Ku Klux Klan. He passed the Enforcement Act. And, we could argue about his monetary policy. I think it was short-sighted and conservative. He precipitated, I think, a recession unduly. But he did end, as I wrote about, another article you folks can check out, he did end an effort at market manipulation. And now I'm thinking here of Jay Gould, the infamous banker and speculator who attempted to corner the gold market. When Grant found out about it, he broke the corner by releasing more gold and tried to, in the process, restore faith and credit in the currency, which was one of his big kind of tasks as president. So again, I think Grant is, frankly, an above average president. He showed great personal courage and put himself on the line and suffered both defection within the Republican Party during his presidency and watched even as his personal popularity continued during his lifetime and beyond. So again, I think Ron Chernow has written a new book on Grant. He's the same author of Hamilton. Whether we'll see a Grant musical, which will revive his fortune,
that would be interesting. Yeah, that's great. And there's actually a new book out by the author Louis Bacone. He just did a book on Grant's tomb, which is fascinating. That's actually on its way with your book from Amazon for me. So I'm looking forward to those 2 books. Now, as far as Grant, would you definitely agree that his memoirs are the greatest written in history, presidential memoirs?
Oh, they're a work of literature.
Yeah, absolutely.
They compare with Caesar's commentaries. I mean, it's in the same tradition. That's what Mark Twain said about them. Yeah. I mean, it's in the same tradition as the great military writing of civilization that's ever been written. And it's written from the conqueror's perspective, but he shows such grace and respect for his antagonists and his opponents. There's a lot to be said about who he seems to hold up and amplify and who he vilifies. And there's been some recent books written about sort of the people who get the short end of the stick in Grant's memoirs. But then, of course, the story of Grant's memoirs and his heroic battle against throat cancer. And it's so poignant. Grant's death and his final days, and to know that he had finished the second volume of the memoirs, and that it would go on also to be a huge financial success for his family. It would provide a way out of debt and comfort for his wife and adult children. So it felt to me like one of sort of a kind of a capstone, a feather in the cap, ultimately for a hero. And he was such a quiet man.
Yeah.
And yet his way with words, he always undervalued himself as a writer, but he was brilliant.
Yeah. It's something I've read, and it's my favorite of all time. And it's just anybody that has not read Grant's memoirs, you should definitely do yourself a favor and do that. We have a question for you. How significantly do you think a reevaluation of presidents that better incorporates their actions in regard to race, civil rights, indigenous land issues would upend traditional POTUS rankings?
It's fantastic. And I would say, again, it requires those of us who do rank to keep those considerations in mind. And of course, I would also argue, like, we're realizing that there are blind spots within all sorts of aspects of American life around these very issues, whether they be in employment or politics or even such things as award shows on television. It seems to me that historians have had blind spots around several presidents in these issues, on particular issues around race. And one we have given, I think, lots of credit to through the years, and I appreciate his life in many ways, but he's coming down, is Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, yeah.
Woodrow Wilson, talk about toxicity. Yeah. His very name on a public building now has become just a flashpoint for the kind of conflict over this exact question about how do we remember and recognize. And I wanted to say, TJ, you would know, as a Jersey guy like me originally, that the city and town of Long Branch, New Jersey, boasts itself as the home of 7 presidents.
Yeah.
And you go to Long Branch, it's a lovely seaside town still. There are memorials to Garfield, to Grant, to Hayes, questionable, by the way, whether he was ever there. Chester A. Arthur, ditto, by the way. Benjamin Harrison, and William McKinley, and Woodrow Wilson.
Yep.
And Wilson, though, ran his 1916 campaign from a mansion, which is burned down, but the site is still there, of Monmouth University.
Yep,
Shadow.
right around the corner. Yep.
And Wilson Library for many years was the name of the library of Monmouth University.
Yeah.
Not anymore.
Yeah.
And so if Monmouth University, the literal site of the 1916 presidential campaign, has deemed it, as has Princeton, the Woodrow Wilson School, no longer, as 2 New Jersey-based sites where Wilson was prominently situated, both Princeton, his home institution, and Monmouth, where he literally ran for and won president a second term. If we now in 2020 have come to this conclusion, I do believe that historians will follow suit, and that we will essentially take our cues from these institutions that in many ways employ us and sustain us. So yeah. I think Wilson is due for a reckoning.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And his name always comes up in this kind of, topic. And then, of course, another one who always comes up is Andrew Jackson, the man who's on the $20 bill. A lot of historians and people have realized that he was not such a good, nice man. And, especially when it comes to Native Americans, so indigenous people. So and his treatment of them. So I think it's definitely something that speaks to how progressive we've become as a society. We're starting to look back on these people that we might have held, like somebody like Jackson, in such high regard, that we're kind of taking a broader look at it and saying, should we really be, holding them up and memorializing them in the way that we have been? So definitely interesting. So before, because I know we're getting a little long, I do want to say, I got to find out, though, your top three presidents. I got to hear it.
I'm so happy we're circling back to that topic.
Yes.
And in many ways, I'm less controversial here. I'm not going to, I think, give you a top 3 that is out of keeping with past rankings. Clearly, I'm not going to include John F. Kennedy. And clearly, Grant is not going to make top 3 either. But I think number 1 is Abraham Lincoln. And I don't think there's much debate about it. In fact, he has been consistently ranked our greatest president in every single poll ever conducted. And the question really is who comes in second place. It has been one of the kind of shifting bits of terrain. And I think this is where we can argue both 2 and 3. But for me, it's going to come down to either George Washington or Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And I personally tend to favor Washington 2 and Roosevelt 3. And I do that because of the foundational role Washington played in establishing the presidency itself and how he has held up. I mean, we're talking about presidents who have not held up and who won't hold up. And I think Washington will endure because of his role as a founder and a framer of this country, and his ultimately impeccable virtue and personal character that we continue to know and appreciate more. See, whereas I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and some would say Theodore Roosevelt deserves to be up there, or Jefferson. The reason I privilege Roosevelt and I keep him in my top 3 is what he did in terms of the 12 years he was president is a sweep of American history from the Great Depression to World War II that is unequaled in terms of time frame. Of course, we now have a term limits on our president, so it can't be equaled. But it's not just that he was elected to 4 terms or that he was popular. It's what those achievements included. The New Deal and the New Deal framework and a commitment to government involvement in the affairs of everyday Americans is a concept that once introduced, and George Will, the conservative writer, laments it, like the leather glove it is, when it stretches, cannot be returned to its smaller, i.e. the government's smaller form. We debate the size and extent to which government should be a part of our life, but we're no longer debating whether government should be at all a part of our life. And that's FDR's crowning achievement. To throw in World War II, though, to me, the greatest and most successful conduct of any war ever by an American president, even more so, I think, than Lincoln's conduct of the Civil War, I think just extends him in a way to be our 3rd greatest president.
Well, it's definitely not a surprising list, that's for sure, like you said. And it's definitely, I mean, I always lean toward Lincoln as number 1. I am a very, very big, not so much, of course, with slavery issue, but I am a very, very big fan of Thomas Jefferson. So, Thomas Jefferson to me is one of the most fascinating, figures in American history. I think sometimes people forget just truly how brilliant of a human being he was, and it's quite fascinating. So, it kind of goes to the fact he's got the same initials as you and I, TJ, and he actually shares my birthday too, April 13th. So there's definitely a little tie that I've always loved there with Jefferson. But Thomas, go ahead.
Since you mentioned birthdays, if I said my birthday, I want to see if you can get the presidential trivia fact associated with it.
Oh, let me see if I can. So, what do you got?
So for all you listeners, now we're going to see if you can stump the expert because it has to do with presidential death.
Yeah, I know, but
if you can get this, I'm going to give you a huge kudos. All right, I'm going to say just the month and the day I was born, and I want you to tell me why it's associated with presidential death.
Okay.
July 9.
Would have been so easy if you told me July 4th, because I could rattle off several. July 9.
And I know you visited the gravesite, although I read, here's my hint. I've read he's the only president to not have a site associated with him. And therefore making him unique as there's no site. So unless I'm mistaken, there should be a grave site. You would have visited it, but no other site with his name on it in the United States.
I don't think it's Calvin Coolidge, is it?
No.
All right, give it to me.
All right. Last hint, because I do want you to get it.
Okay.
The year he died. The year he died.
Okay. What is it?
18. 50. And I think our live stream audience may have guessed it right. If you want to peek.
Oh! Yeah, that's not fair, Kurt. You know everything. It is Taylor. Okay. You know what's interesting about Taylor? So you should have given me the hint that they actually dug him up at one point. Then I would have gotten it, hit the nail on the head. That's interesting. You know what's fascinating about Taylor? I found really fascinating, just to touch on this real quick, that he was not even aware that he was nominated for president. Yeah. You know, for the presidency. Like, it's just, so fascinating when you learn this stuff about these.
It goes more than that. He got so much mail, and back in those days, you actually would send the mail without postage. It would be postage due. That the actual letter informing him he had been nominated was returned for lack of postage. And the Whig Party, literally chagrined, quickly paid for postage and sent the letter back.
That's pretty funny. That is interesting. You know, have you ever seen his gravesite by any chance?
See, this is why I was saying, my understanding, and there's a movement among some students, in fact, to associate a site with Zachary Taylor, because I don't believe there is one. So that's why I was going to ask you about the Taylor gravesite.
Yeah, Taylor gravesite, it's actually interesting. So the original tomb that he was originally interred in is right behind the mausoleum tomb that stands today, literally like right behind it. And it's interesting because it's the Zachary Taylor National Cemetery, so it's a military cemetery. So just like any military cemetery anybody's ever seen, it's got pretty much just the white crosses that are all lined up in a row for the soldiers and the veterans there. It's really nice. It's not overly big. There's not much to it. It's just it looks like something like your great grandfather would be buried in. You know what I mean? Just a regular mausoleum. It's nothing huge. It's just it just kind of stands there. But the interesting thing about Taylor, even more so than his death site, is his birthplace is really debated. So I found his birth site, which I believe, if I remember correctly, was in Virginia. I believe it was Virginia. Yes. But that's been debated that plantation that I saw was where he was actually born. So, you know, and I find that so fascinating too. Like, I understand the records, and of course that happens a lot more. Those discrepancies happen a lot more with the birthplaces, of course, because no one knew when they were born that, you know, hey, they would grow up to be president. So
I was telling my students today, we don't even really know what state Andrew Jackson was born in.
No, that's up for debate. It's either North Carolina. I mean, who knows? It's right on the border either way, and both states, they hold, you know, true to we are the birthplace of Andrew Jackson. So it is quite interesting. But, and, you know, it is interesting too at some of these places that you go, some of these homes of these earlier presidents, like Jackson's Hermitage there in Tennessee, you know, where, as we just touched on earlier, the whole Native American and treatment and the way he handled that, there's no mention of that anywhere in Hermitage. And, you know, I understand it's his home and, you know, it's a memorial for him, but you would think like there would be maybe some mention of, like, you know, this kind of, you know, this controversy and that sort of thing. And there's nothing. So it just goes to show that even these places that we hold as like historical, factual places, sometimes that's not even the case. And so it's very interesting. It's not just the internet where you might get some false or misleading information or facts. It's really just based on whoever's telling and who the storyteller is of those facts or stories, so to speak. But Thomas, this has been fascinating, and I got to tell you, I could do another 2 hours with you because I love this topic. I am actually going to be doing a presidential gravesite ranking where I'm actually going to rank, or pretty much not even rank, give them all grade, like an A through F grade of what I feel about their gravesite when I'm done with my presidential series. And I hope that you and I in the future can do another live stream, because I would love to discuss more things with you, because I'm fascinated with all this presidential and vice presidential stuff. And this is, I can't thank you enough for your time. I know that we didn't have a ton of people on, but everybody keeps, commenting how much they enjoyed it. And I know this will be very well watched when I, of course, post it on my YouTube channel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave all of your, sites, your Twitter and your article links and that sort of thing down below, so people can definitely go check those out. Please make sure you go check out Thomas's book, that Bosom Friends. It's going to be something I am super excited, and I probably will be mentioning it on my YouTube channel and such after I'm done reading it. So go pick yourself up a copy of that and make sure you read that. And again, Thomas, I can't thank you enough for your time and joining us tonight. And I hope this was somewhat enjoyable for yourself.
I enjoyed myself very much. Thank you for having me on, TJ. Thanks to all your viewers, and hope to hear from some of you someday.
All right. Sounds good. Thomas, thank you so much. You and I will be in touch soon, I'm sure.
Take care.
Take care now. Bye-bye.